Hello everyone, my name is William Sia. I'm currently a senior debater at Ladue Horton Watkins High School, and today I'll be bringing you a lecture on judge adaptation. Now, first of all, we have to ask ourselves, what is judge adaptation? Well, essentially, it's this idea that's really universal in every style of debate, where we learn information about how our judges view the round or how much experience they may have in a round, and then change the way we debate and speak based on that information. So, in order to do that effectively in policy debate, first we have to think about the types of judges. So, we can categorize judges into three main different groups. The first type is known as a lay judge. So, a lay judge is one that's very typical in Eastern Missouri. They may have little to no experience in debate. This isn't just policy debate, it would be debate in general. So, examples of lay judges would be parents, teachers who aren't coaches, other school staff, people who are just looking to help out at a local invitational but don't have much experience in debate. All of these individuals would be considered lay judges. So, important things to keep in mind when it comes to debating in front of a lay judge. It's important to first of all look at where we get our credibility from. In general, there are a few main key things that every lay judge is going to like and want to see in a debate round. So they'll be evaluating you heavily on, for example, the strength of your speaking skill. If you're a confident, fluent, and articulate speaker, then that's going to score you points with this type of judge. Additionally, another important thing is how easy are you to understand. One of the most problematic things when it comes to policy debaters is oftentimes we don't try and make things super understandable to the common person. We just go down the flow, use a lot of jargon, whereas for lay judges who don't have much exposure to the types of jargon that we use in policy debate or the strange things that we do for the sake of efficiency in policy debate, they'd rather prefer to see a debate that's understandable, one where each team tells a cohesive story and stuff like that. So, some tips for achieving those types of goals in front of a lay judge: speak more slowly. That's the first big thing. In policy debate, we have a tendency to speak really fast or faster than average, especially compared to PUF or LD, because we want to get out more information in the amount of time that we're given. In front of a lay judge, you should be cautious about this. You want to speak more slowly because you want to ensure that the lay judge understands you, especially since they aren't flowing everything you say. Next, you should use less debate jargon. So in policy debate, we have a ton of debate jargon, whether it's the term counterplan, perms, theory, critiques, all of this stuff. All of this is pretty complex to understand, but and because of that, we use debate jargon to sort of shorten these complicated ideas in our debate round to save time. But in front of a lay judge, they don't know what this jargon means. So you should try and use as little debate jargon as possible. Now, that being said, it's still a policy debate, so you're going to have to use some jargon at some point. But keep in mind, when you do use debate jargon, for example, when you propose a counterplan in the 1NC, you should explain that jargon. One thing that I find myself doing a lot as a 1N in this past year is that when I read a topicality shell, I like to explain what the role of topicality is in the debate and explain why it matters, especially in front of lay judges, because that way they're in the know and they understand what this argument I'm making actually means. Next, you should tell a cohesive story. So this goes to ease of understanding. So I have three main principles for telling a cohesive story in front of lay judges. First, contextualize. Lay judges oftentimes don't have the prior knowledge that oftentimes we do. We do all of this extensive research, preparation, and practice for every single round. Lay judges walk into a round, sit down, and expect to understand what's going on. But they don't have the same training or research protocols that we as debaters typically have. So for that reason, it's important to contextualize everything in a round. So when you're presenting a plan as the affirmative team, you should be talking about why is this plan important, what's going on in the world that makes this plan important, and things like that. When you make arguments on the flow, for example, you're making a rebuttal response, it's not simply enough to just say this is a fact. You also have to contextualize this fact to the rest of the debate and the rest of the world. So that's what we mean by contextualize. The next thing is define. Now, this is one that you'll see often in PUF. So in PUF, oftentimes cases have definitions in front of them for terms that judges may not know. Well, that is useful in PUF because it's helpful for helping judges understand what the debate is about. Well, in policy debate, we can do a similar thing. So we should also define things. So this doesn't necessarily mean you need a definition, like a topicality definition, to explain everything that's going on. But when you do drop a term, it can be helpful to add a definition for that term afterwards, just so that your judge is in the know about what exactly you're talking about. The final thing is explain. So this one will feel really bad if you're used to faster types of debates, but explanations are going to be extremely important. Not only do they showcase that you know or you're confident in what you're talking about, but explanations are also important so that judges can understand you. And in front of lay judges especially, explanations are super important because if you don't explain the logic behind everything you say, then you risk losing them and there being a logical gap, which could cost you their ballot. The final thing, just some more speaking advice. Speak confidently and fluently. After all, if you sound confident, you sound fluent, and you sound credible, and you know what you're talking about, you're going to score a lot more points with lay judges. So the second type of judge is the flow judge. So flow judges are what we are typically used to on the national circuit. So they have extensive experience in policy debate, and examples of types of flow judges. Some coaches are going to be flow judges. College debaters typically are flow judges. Former high school policy debaters, those are all flow judges because they have a lot of experience in policy debate specifically. Now, you might get some judges that have experience in PUF or experience in LD, but not much experience in policy. That's a different type of judge, and we'll touch on those later. What you need to know about flow judges is they have extensive experience in policy debate. So they've either done it, they've been heavily involved in it, etc., etc. So they have a lot of understanding of what's going on. So in terms of how do we look good in front of a flow judge, so the things that oftentimes they look for. So first of all, compared to lay judges, there's a lot more emphasis on strength of argumentation. If what you say makes sense from a logical perspective, then you're more likely to score points with a flow judge as opposed to making little sense but having strong speaking, just as an example. The next, demonstrable skill in the activity. If you can show your judge that you know what you're doing, you know how this activity works, you're going to earn their respect. Now, obviously, for a lay judge, this is less important because lay judges don't really have any idea of what demonstrable skill in the activity means. But for a flow judge, it's going to be really important to show that you know what you're doing. And then the final thing, which even though it's less important than the other two, still is important, is the strength of speaking. If you have good arguments, but you aren't that great of a speaker, it may be helpful for all judges if you improve how fluently or confidently you are as a speaker. Because at the end of the day, how you present information, regardless of how logically clear or how strong your arguments are, how you present information still has an impact on your persuasiveness. So that's still something to keep in mind when it comes to flow judges. So just some tips for meeting those three criteria. First, we should touch on speed. One common misconception is that all flow judges are going to be comfortable with speed. They're fine with spreading, you speaking extremely quickly. This isn't necessarily true, especially in Eastern Missouri. We have a lot of coaches who don't like speed, but they do understand everything that you would say in a policy debate round. So for those judges, it's important not to just randomly assume that because they're a flow judge, you can go fast. You should make sure that they're comfortable with speed first, and we'll talk about that later when we talk about figuring out what type of judge you have. The next thing, use debate jargon. So in contrast with lay judges, it's important to use debate jargon because at the end of the day, it's strategically efficient. They know what you're talking about when you say a counterplan or topicality, so you don't need to go off on a tangent explaining what topicality is. That's just a waste of time, and ultimately that waste of time may be strategically ineffective. Next is the paradigm. So paradigms are basically this set of principles that each flow judge may or may not have. So if you have a super flow judge, for example, someone who judges on the national circuit, has a ton of experience in policy debate, maybe they do debate and they're a college student, they will know what a paradigm is, and basically it gives a bunch of information about what types of arguments they like, what types of arguments they don't like. So, for example, a paradigm could be I like traditional argumentation. I like impact debates. I like counterplans. I like disadvantages, topicality, theory, all that stuff. What I don't like are critical argumentations. I don't like Ks. I don't understand Ks. I don't think they're legitimate, etc., etc., etc. All of those collectively is known as a paradigm and basically says what a judge likes or doesn't like in terms of argumentation. Next, even in front of flow judges, you should be telling a cohesive story. But the two ways that we do that in flow judges, in front of flow judges, are going to be vastly different for lay judges. For lay judges, where everything's focused on making sure that they understand everything, for flow judges, it's making sure that you sound understandable to the extent where they can follow you. Obviously, this bar is much higher for lay judges in comparison to flow judges, but that doesn't mean it just falls by the wayside. So the two tips I have for telling a cohesive story in front of flow judges are: first, writing the ballot. So this is touched on in a lecture about 2NRs and 2ARs, but at the end of the day, your win conditions, how you win the round, why you win the round, all of these things are still going to be super important because you don't want to leave it in the hands of your judge if you can. You want to tell your judge how they should look at the round and how looking at the round proves that you've won their ballot. The second main tip I have is uniting the flow. So one thing that can be problematic when I've judged some high school debate rounds is that people tend not to talk about every single flow, or when they do talk about every single flow, there isn't really any cohesiveness to the entire way they treat that flow. And this is once again directed at mainly the rebuttal speeches. So when I say unite the flow, what I mean by that is try to make connections between different flows. So for example, in front of a flow judge, my order of speech may go, as a 2AR, may go the case, and then the disadvantage. So in that case, I would go through the case, and rather than treat inherency, solvency, advantage, framing as different issues, I would treat it all as one single issue and just flow through it cohesively as if it's one main argument. And then I would treat the disadvantage as the other argument, the basic negative argumentation, and in that way I can sort of collect everything up and put it in a more cohesive manner besides just the blippy line by line that we're used to in constructive speeches. The final tip I have here is to speak confidently and fluently. Once again, speaking is always going to be important. It's important for your persuasiveness, just less so for flow judges, but even still, you should be able to speak confidently and fluently to at least help your credibility in the debate round. The final type of judge we're going to talk about is the Flay Judge. So I mentioned a little bit about this before. So Flay Judges typically have experience with debate, or they have some experience with policy debate. So you can think of a Flay Judge as in between a lay judge and a flow judge, hence the term Flay Judge. It's a combination of lay and flow. So they aren't as inexperienced as a lay judge because they know some of the basic principles of debate or even policy debate, but they aren't as experienced in flow judges in that they don't necessarily know all of the ins and outs of policy debate, like the jargon or speed or all of that stuff. So examples of types of Flay judges. So a lot of coaches are going to be Flay judges, especially in Eastern Missouri. And determining whether a coach judge is a Flay judge or a flow judge, ultimately we'll talk about that when we talk about determining what type of judge you have. Other types of Flay judges, current or former Puff and LD debaters. So they have extensive experience in debate. They know what debate looks like, but they may not know all of the specifics of policy debate. And then finally, we have experienced judges. So this term refers to judges who frequently judge policy debates, but didn't necessarily have any involvement in policy debate themselves. So, for example, parents who judge every single year, parents of former high school debaters, parents of former high school policy debaters, if they've judged extensively and have judged many, many rounds, they know pretty much what the basics of debate are, but they aren't in the know about the nitty-gritty details when it comes to policy debate. So once again, we're going to talk about the types of things or what you should be aiming for in front of a flow judge. So first is strength of argumentation. Similarly to a flow judge, the cohesiveness of your argumentation, how logically sound everything is, that's going to be pretty important for a Flay judge. Not to say it isn't important for lay judges, but in general for Flay and flow judges, it is more important to have a logically cohesive argument. Next, similarly to lay judges, you're going to want to have an ease of understanding. Because Flay judges don't necessarily have the same experience in policy debate as a flow judge, we can't rely more on jargon, and we still need explanations a lot of the time to help our judges understand what exactly we're talking about. Then the final thing, as always, strength of speaking. You need to be a good speaker. It's the same case for flow judges and lay judges. So for Flay judges, you also want to try and be as strong of a speaker as possible. So just some tips to meet those types of criteria. So first, we'll touch on speed. So Flay judges are more comfortable with speed than lay judges, but not as much as flow judges. This is just in general. You might find the odd Flay judge who's okay with hyper fast 300 words per minute spreading, but most of the time Flay judges aren't going to be as comfortable with you talking extremely quickly. So you should but you shouldn't treat them like you shouldn't treat them like they can't follow anything and speak extremely slowly. It's basically your call on how fast you go, but just know that they're in between when it comes to speed compared to flow and lay judges. Next, I mentioned this earlier, they may know basic debate jargon. So for example, a former Puff or LD debater, they're gonna know what you're talking about when you say stuff like impacts or links, but they aren't going to know policy debate specific jargon. So if you talk about topicality or a counterplan, all of those are specific to policy debate, but not Puff or LD or debate in general. So that type of jargon, you have to be conscientious and cognizant of the fact that they may not know that. And then once again, tell a cohesive story. So this is a little bit tweaked compared to lay judges. So contextualize and explain, both of those are still important, but as opposed to define, I have describe here. So typically Flay judges, they will be more knowledgeable of some terms. So defining might still be important, but also it's important to describe exactly what you're talking about, because illustrating that is also going to be super important in front of a Flay judge. And then finally, as always, speak confidently and fluently. So that was the 3 types of judges. So now that we know a little bit about what each judge is and what types of decisions we should be making based on what these types of judges are, we need to determine what types of judges we have in our rounds. So determining judge paradigms is basically all about asking questions. So before you begin the round, when all judges are present and your opponents are present, typically you want to ask the judge some questions about how much experience they have, stuff about speed, any paradigms, etc., etc., etc. So this all takes place before the round begins, but after everyone is present in the room, just so everyone in the debate has this important information for the actual debate at hand. So here's the process that I typically use when I'm asking questions to determine a paradigm. So first things first, you always want to make sure your judge is okay with you asking questions. So some judges aren't going to be okay if you ask them a bunch of questions out of the blue. They might feel a bit uncomfortable, in which case that would already be scoring bad. You'd already be scoring negative points with that judge because you came off as annoying because you didn't ask them whether or not they were okay with you asking this barrage of questions. Now, most of the time, judges are fine if you ask them some questions, but if they aren't, I like to assume they're a lay judge. We have no information about them, and typically flow judges and Flay judges, they have enough experience in debate to know that questions are fine and that the questions we ask aren't going to be super invasive or anything. So in general, I just like to play it safe and assume they're a lay judge. But in most cases, the judges will be okay with you asking them questions. So in which case, you start asking about the judge's experience with policy debate. So we do this to try and figure out whether they're a lay, Flay, or flow judge. So a lot of the common responses you might get, for example, a lay judge, if they're a parent, might say, "Oh, This is my first time judging policy debate. I'm here volunteering at my local invitational, right? That would be an indication they don't have much experience with policy debate specifically, so they're probably a lay judge. Some judges, like, for example, a coach judge, may say, I have extensive experience in policy debate. I've been coaching this activity for X number of years. Or, for example, a college debater may say, I do debate in college, and I have judged many around. All of those responses, you can glean some important information to help you determine if they're a lay, flay, or a flow judge. The next question you're going to want to ask is about paradigms. So there are two ways to ask paradigms, and as I explained earlier, paradigms is helpful for figuring out how you want to debate the round. If a judge likes certain types of arguments or doesn't like certain types of arguments, that could affect what goes in a 1NC or what advantage you would extend into the 2AR. So if you have a lay judge or flay judge, if you think that they're going to be a lay judge or flay judge, rather than ask them, drop the jargon paradigm, you should ask them what they like to see in a debate. So this may not give you concrete, super specific answers. They're not going to say, oh, I don't like counterplans, because they won't know what the term they won't have heard of the specific term counterplan before, most likely. But this does give you information as to what types of things they value in a round. So sometimes lay judges will say, for example, oh, I value confident speaking and clear speaking, right? And that's an indication that you should, above all else, try and make sure that you sound confident and clear. Or maybe a judge will say, oh, I like this type of argument, for example. They might say, oh, I'm super interested in this topic, or drop some other information that you can maybe discern some helpful information about what types of things they enjoy watching in a round. The other way to ask about paradigm, if you know a judge is a flow judge, and this is important, not just think a judge is a flow judge. If you know a judge is a flow judge and they know what the term paradigm means, then you should ask them if they have a paradigm. So sometimes they might direct you to tab room, because oftentimes judges post like written out paradigms about every argument that could possibly be run. And in which case you should go read those if you're in an online setting, or if you're in an in-person setting, they may just straight up out and tell you about the paradigm, or just touch on some key things within their personal paradigm. And all of that information is going to be most likely about ways that they prefer you run arguments, types of arguments they prefer, etc., and that's going to be super helpful. The next thing you should do, if you think the judge is a flow judge, you should ask them about speed. Typically, lay judges and flay judges, it's safe to assume that they aren't going to be okay if you go 300 words per minute and spread your 1AC. So usually I just don't bother asking this question if I think that they're a lay or a flay judge, because regardless, if I go a bit slower, even if they are a bit on the flow side, for a flay judge, they'll be fine with it, because it never hurts to be safe. But if they are a flow judge, you should ask them about speed, because as I mentioned earlier, not all flow judges are comfortable with speed, so you should double check and make sure before you start going 300 words per minute, lips on fire, like spreading all out. The final thing that I should note is that you shouldn't treat all judges the same. So even if we can categorize them into 3 broad categories, lay, flay, and flow, not every judge is the same. For example, different flow judges are going to have different paradigms. You might have a judge who likes Ks and critical argumentation. You might have a judge who really likes topicality, or you might have a judge who really likes counterplans and case debate. All 3 of these judges are considered flow judges, but they're not the same because of their paradigms. And additionally, with lay judges, you can look at this distinction too. So maybe a lay judge, they don't have much experience in policy debate, but maybe you look them up on LinkedIn and they turn out to be a professor of economics, in which case it's safe to assume that they have a good understanding if you decide to run an economics-related disadvantage. Or sometimes some judges aren't fluent in English, or not that they're not fluent in English. Sometimes judges aren't sometimes for judges, English isn't their first language. So, for example, my parents, English isn't their first language, but they have judged policy rounds before. So, in those types of scenarios, you want to make sure that you are being as understandable and as clear as possible, because English may not be their first language. So all of that just goes to show that each judge is different, and you should treat each judge with the same amount of respect, but make in-round adaptations accordingly based on specific things that you know about the judge. So the final thing we'll talk about when it comes to determining a judge's paradigm is, what does it look like to make in-round adaptations according to the information that you've gleaned from asking a bunch of questions. So first of all, we need to look at what arguments does your judge like or not like. So this relates specifically to the paradigm. So maybe a judge doesn't like topicality, in which case, even if your opponents are running an untopical AF, maybe it's better to go for your generic counterplan and generic disadvantage in the round as opposed to topicality, because you know the judge doesn't like or doesn't believe in topicality arguments for the negative. Maybe a judge does like critical argumentation, in which case, if you're hitting an AF and you have the option to run a K, maybe you should go for it and run the K, run it well, and try and get on that judge's soft spot for K arguments. Maybe a judge dislikes or likes theory. Most of the time when it comes to theory, a paradigm will say like, oh, I believe conditionality is good, or maybe conditionality is a debate. I'm willing to listen to theory debates, or maybe stuff about perm arguments, or specific theory arguments, in which case those are niche scenarios. But if those types of arguments do come up and around, just keep what the judge thinks about those arguments in mind when it comes to actually debating those arguments. The next thing is going to be counterplans. Sometimes flow judges may not like counterplans. Sometimes they do like counterplans. Sometimes they really, really like counterplans. So based on how much they like counterplans, you can act accordingly about whether or not you run it, whether or not you go for it, etc., etc. And then the final thing is impact framing. So impact framing really comes down to this idea of truth versus tech. So some flow judges will argue that they prefer true arguments over logically well-argued arguments. So, for example, if your opponents drop a response, but that response is something along the lines of racism is good, well, that's obviously untrue. And even though it's dropped and maybe helps the team who made that argument, a judge who says, I prefer true arguments over tech, they would choose to just throw out the argument altogether because it's wholly untrue. Now, obviously, that's an extreme case. No one's probably ever going to say racism is good in any policy debate round. But truth versus tech basically means try and make your arguments as close to the truth as possible, because that way your judge will be more likely to be convinced by those arguments. Now, the flip side is obviously tech over truth. This is the idea where you doing good debate is going to outweigh whether or not your arguments are really rooted in real world problems. So for example, if you make an argument about, maybe you make a broad sweeping statement about how political candidates act in an election. You may not be completely correct because it's a complicated thing and it comes down to many different things, psychology, economics, etc. But your broad sweeping claim, if it goes dropped by the opposing team without a response, well, even if it's not completely true or the most true claim ever, a tech over truth judge will still buy that argument because it went dropped and the other team didn't handle the flow well, and they'll prefer those types of arguments. Even if there's a grain of untruthfulness in those arguments. And then the other thing to look at when it comes to in-round adaptation is how your judge handles speed. So there are super lay judges. So it's sort of a spectrum. There's the slowest, which I would call a super lay judge. And then there's the fastest, which is obviously spreading. And then there's everyone in between. So a super lay judge may not have, as I mentioned, English may not be their first language. Maybe they aren't super comfortable with maybe they aren't super comfortable with the pace that I'm speaking right now, which I consider to be fairly slow, despite it being in general a bit above average when it comes to pace of speaking. And in those cases, try and slow down. I definitely make conscientious efforts to slow down. Lay judges, maybe you don't need to slow down as much, but you should still slow down. Flay judges, you make your call based on how fast you think they can handle. Flow judges, obviously, speaking quickly can work and may be effective. And then finally, obviously, we have spreading, 300 words per minute, blazing fast, argumentation, all of that stuff. So yeah, based on the question that you asked earlier about whether or not your flow judge can handle speed, or other information that you glean about what your judge is, whether they're a lay judge or a flay judge or a flow judge, can help you make in-round adaptations as to how you decide how fast you're going to go in every single speech. And then the final thing is, are there any specifics you should keep in mind? So some of the things I mentioned earlier, maybe a lay judge or a flay judge will mention that there's a specific way of speaking or a specific aspect of speaking that they like to pay attention to. So for example, some judges like confident speaking, some judges like fluent speaking. Maybe a judge says they'll pay attention to cross-examination. Maybe cross-examination plays a factor in their ballot. For most judges, it doesn't really, but maybe for some judges, they really do look at cross-examination, in which case, try and make sure you put a lot of effort into the questions and answers that you ask and give in cross-examination periods. Yeah, and then, so those are some examples of specifics that aren't really under any broad category of paradigm or speed, but are still important to keep in mind when you are actually debating in round. So that about does it for judge adaptation and everything I have to say on it. The final thing I'll note is that judge adaptation, you shouldn't be too worried if this seems like a lot. This is just a bunch of stuff that I've picked up over many years of policy debate. And in reality, when you do it in round, it's not actually that complicated. It's just when you put it on paper or in a slideshow presentation like I have, it's obviously going to look a little bit daunting because there's so many different possibilities for what types of judges you get. But as long as you're following the questioning process that I've outlined for you in today's lecture, and you're learning how to do in-round adaptations, and you're experimenting, whether it's in a practice round or maybe in a preliminary round in a tournament, you should be able to get the hang of judge adaptation pretty quickly, and hopefully that will do a lot in terms of the amount of success that you see as a result of your debating. So that's all I have. Thank you for listening.